Well, on Saturday, the African National Congress celebrated its 112th anniversary, and that was at the Mbombela Stadium in Mpumalanga. The executive director at the Social Policy Initiative, Isobel Frye, is in studio with us now for a discussion around the ruling party's January 8 statements and its economic policies. Isobel, thank you so much for chatting to us this Sunday afternoon. Quite a busy Saturday it was for ANC members as President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, laid out the party's January 8 statements. I took a listen to it and I'd done a preview on what we're likely to hear. Similar action plans, and I don't want to say it's the same action plans because we understand that it takes a while to get economic policy going, but talk us through your thoughts of this year's January 8.
Thank you, and again, thanks so much for the opportunity and invitation. I have to say that January 8th is historically a really important time for the ANC to set forward as the ruling party, but as the liberation movement as well, its plan for the year. So it comes, of course, before and ahead of SONA and the budget, which are two nationally important dates. For an election year, I think that the contents of this year's January 8th was incredibly disappointing. It's as if it didn't start to unfold. I mean, if you just take the opening statement, which was instead of having a program of action for this election year, the ruling party decided to take last year's 6 points and work on them. Now, as you say, of course, you can't achieve a universe in 1 year. But to not say this is the election year, this is what we're going to celebrate, this is what we're going to do, and given the huge geopolitical shift that had happened, this is where we're going to go. The January 8th statement really should be the foundation for the election manifesto that's going to come out next month. But we saw nothing of that. The ANC did not take its membership, let alone the nation, into its confidence and say, this is why we're the confident party, this is what we've achieved, and this is how we can do more if you vote for us.
And I feel like, if anything, those points kind of depressed you a little bit because it's like it's the same points that we were dealing with 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. What are the issues, Isobel? Because some of the economists and analysts that I spoke to in the week are saying that it's not that ANC policies are necessarily bad or terrible. Some of them are really good ideas and plans, but the issue is implementation. Do you share those sentiments?
It's difficult to sometimes see where one begins and the other ends. So we know that implementation hasn't occurred, so I think I would agree on that. But if you look at the main points, which is economic growth, I was looking at last year's January 8th and then back to 2019. In 2019, we were looking at agriculture, tourism and mining being the 3 points which were going to grow the economy. Then, of course, we had COVID, which hit tourism out of the sector. But we don't see the industrial manufacturing renewal that we keep on getting told about. So this year, one of the main points that they run with is beneficiation. Now, we've been told beneficiation because, of course, one of the curses of the SADC region is that we are rich in minerals, but we don't beneficiate, so we don't create jobs, we don't benefit from the value add here that gets exported, we import that. So we know that. But what do you need for beneficiation of minerals? Smelting. You need electricity, you need energy, and you need effective rail and ports. Now, we don't have either of those. So, in effect, what we're doing is putting up empty promises, and there's nothing substantive. There is a whole lot, I think, that we should have picked up on that could be celebrated.
Tell us about that. What do you think the party should be focusing on? Because even with the economic policies over the years, there'll be changes, and it's stagnant for a while. What do you think the ruling party should be focusing on that will get the economy on the right track?
So I've got to answer that by sort of referencing a bad news story, and that's unemployment. Now, I think we often talk about unemployment and shrug it off like we do poverty and inequality, but we need to contextualize it. Unemployment in South Africa has the highest unemployment in the world. The country that comes after us is Djibouti, which is an arid, conflict-ridden desert country of under 1 million people. And so we have a massive unemployment problem. A paper that Frye is releasing this week, written by Duma Kubule, refers to this as akin to a war effort. We need to actually be taking stops out. Now, if you look at the January 8th statement, we get told that 5.7 million youth between the ages of 15 and 34 are employed, and that's true. What they don't say is that 6.7 million are unemployed. We also talk about the fact that 300,000 jobs, or the ANC talks about the fact that 300,000 jobs have been created. What they don't say is that each year, 800,000 people enter the labour market that need to be absorbed. So the question is, what do we do to absorb people? And from the research that we've done, really what we need to be doing is redistributing income. We need a universal basic income, which means that everybody has access to income and becomes an economic actor. And then you have a demand up from the bottom up, which will look at industrial supply, it will look at manufacturing, and it will also ensure that people have enough, that taxes generated from an increase in expenditure will go straight to the state coffers. And so what we'll do is we'll start generating the levels of GDP growth that will justify additional spending, which would then, in effect, keep that a positive loop. That is the one positive story which we didn't see. We didn't see that at the beginning of the January 8th, the President said, referred to the social relief of distress grant. But it didn't come anywhere, again, in the whole looking at poverty, unemployment and inequality. That is the good news story. That is the story that South Africa is able to extend to more people than any other country in Africa. Social security. We're the most unequal country, so we need to be leveling out. There is such opportunity if you then introduce microeconomic policies that are linked to a cash redistribution of sufficient level to start generating that. We can't create jobs for 11.7 million people. It is not possible. But we can ensure that everybody has the opportunity to run their own livelihood, to start uplifting their community, and so have that generation. That's the kind of innovation that we need, but instead we're trapped in a neoliberal economic policy which says we have to look at debt and inflation. If we look at debt, if we just look at debt, South Africa's debt is 75% of GDP. The global equivalent is 93%, the average. So we're not that high. But the reason why there is a constraint on borrowing is because we don't have GDP growth. But if we're not borrowing, we are not able to stimulate and have the stimulus to have the growth. So we're actually slowly shrinking. And at the same time, more people are having their needs unmet. We have an election year, as I started off by saying, where are the policies that, policies that say, we see people. Instead, we see politicians who are looking for positions frequently, instead of saying these are the policies that will transform. And it's not just, I know we're talking about the January 8th statement, but I mean, one of the things that I'm going to be doing this year is a podcast just looking at each of the electoral parties and what their promises are, because I have not been overwhelmed by any.
Yeah, very underwhelming. And there seems to be a disconnect, Isobel, perhaps as a final question, to talk us through just the socio-economic makeup that we're in South Africa. You know, President Cyril Ramaphosa really highlighting what the party has done in the country over the last 30 years. And I think a question that has also been there is how long, perhaps, until we get a new benchmark to the growth that we are seeing as a country away from apartheid. Perhaps you could touch on that, but perhaps also looking at just the socio-economic issues and on a global landscape, as you said, you know, the shifting geopolitical issues that we're facing, where South Africa often finds itself in the middle of it. How do we then navigate those spaces, and what are some opportunities that if we strike while the iron is hot, we could actually then see some of that growth out of them?
I mean, as you say, the entire landscape to an extent is determined by exogenous factors. So we had the Ukrainian war 2 years ago. We now have the Palestinian war by Israel on Palestine. And that, of course, affects, in addition to the tragedies, the human tragedies in those stories, for South Africans, it affects the oil price, and we also start importing inflation on food production. So we are captured, we're prisoners of that. We can't get out of it. But I think that if we were to look at the Southern African region, as we were discussing off camera, this year we have elections in South Africa, in Namibia, Botswana and Mozambique. So there's a lot of change. The question is, once the new governments come into being, Are there ways in which we can benefit? We've got the Africa Free Trade Continent Agreement. How do we use that to benefit ourselves if the other traditional markets are being closed because logistics and transport? But I mean, one of the interesting facts is that right now there's an American-backed plan to build a big port in Namibia to export from DRC. Yeah. At the same time, the Chinese are backing the development of a rail and port through Mozambique. Now, how does South Africa feature there? There's a huge amount that can be done, but what we need to be doing is recognize 2 or 3 main points that we can do nationally. So I would say, without apology and hesitation, roll out a UBI, Universal Basic Income. Start looking at taxation around that. In addition to that, we need to make sure that there is sufficient food. And I would also say that the infrastructure projects, which have been working quite well, get those done. And that includes Eskom, of course. Yeah. Because if we don't have the energy, we can't. But also then start negotiating conditional or trade beneficial deals with our neighbors. What kinds of levels of food production are required? What kinds of mining commodities? I mean, a lot of the minerals that the rest of the world is looking for, we have within our region. But we need to make sure that that Transnet comes to the party, that basically we're able to operate as an equal partner, not one limping behind. And so we can start dictating some of those. But those are ways in which we can get people into jobs once we make sure that their basic needs are met. So there is a sequencing that needs to be sorted out, and we don't see that. We've got 5 years in the new administration. Meet people's basic needs, create the jobs, but also make sure that we take back our role within the sub-region, so we don't have superpowers coming in and dictating the terms. And once again, a kind of neo-colonialism coming in, where our goods are taken out, our labor is being extracted, and we don't benefit.